The crystalline spires of the Krill Consensus Hall pierced the ambient twilight, their surfaces humming faintly with the residual energy of millennia of debate and decision. Light filtered through the refractive architecture designed to dampen emotional output and enforce meditative calm, cast long, prismatic shadows across the assembled delegation. At the apex of the tiered amphitheater, seated upon the primary observational dais, High Counselor Thrax of the Krill felt the tremor in the stone beneath his multifaceted feet, a resonance that mirrored the unease rippling through the assembled representatives of the Galactic Concord. Before them, hovering in the sterile void of the primary display nexus, floated the spectral rendering of the anomaly, a single, insignificant vessel detected just beyond the established quarantine perimeter of Sector 7 Gamma. It was small, crudely assembled by Concord standards, yet it carried the indelible, terrifying signature of its origin, Class 115 designation, Terra. The initial spectroscopic analysis remains consistent, droned Delegate Vorn of the Thraxian subsector, his voice a modulated series of clicks and whistles translated by the chamber's universal interface into sterile, authoritative tones. Minimal shielding, primitive kinetic defenses. Propulsion signatures are erratic, bordering on self-destructive. It is a ghost, an echo from a dead region of space, yet it pulses with life signs. Vorn projected a tighter schematic, emphasizing the vessel's blunt, unrefined silhouette. It is a bathtub attempting to navigate a gravity well. It should not function. It should not exist this far from its parent body. The assembled delegates shifted, the sound akin to dry leaves scuttling across polished obsidian. The Krill, masters of controlled entropy and slow, methodical expansion, found this raw, unfiltered biological assertion deeply offensive to the cosmic order they meticulously maintained. High Counselor Thrax extended a sensory filament towards the display, feeling the faint, almost nostalgic heat signature emanating from the anomaly. Insignificant, yes, Delegate Vorn, but the context is significant. The Terran sphere, designated Class 115, was catalogued as an extinction-level event centuries ago. A self-immolating biological experiment, too volatile, too chaotic for integration or even observation. Its designation was absolute, unsalvageable instability. Thrax paused, allowing the weight of the classification to settle. The Krill remembered the brief, sharp flares of uncontrolled stellar manipulation emanating from that sector, the species consumed by its own accelerating internal conflicts, burning itself out in a spectacular, localized supernova of ambition. For something to emerge from that precise void, intact, displaying active transit metrics. It suggests something has survived the crucible, and whatever survives a Class 115 Deathworld is rarely something we wish to welcome to the civilized expanse. The representative from the Cygnian hegemony, a being of pure, condensed plasma shielded within a containment sphere of shimmering liquid metal, pulsed with agitated light. Precautionary action dictates immediate dissolution. We have established protocols for quarantine zones, Counselor. The very atmosphere radiating from that artifact carries residues of high-energy fusion reactions incompatible with stable spatial fabrics. Allowing it to approach the perimeter compromises decades of careful spatial regulation. The Cygnian voice, when translated, resonated with cold, pragmatic efficiency. Why delay? The threat matrix is clear. It is a disease vector from a failed experiment. Patience, hegemon, Thrax countered, his tone hardening slightly. He felt the familiar, frustrating resistance of the other powers. The Krill operated on observation and synthesis. The hegemony operated on immediate surgical eradication. We have not yet confirmed intent. Destruction without interrogation sets a dangerous precedent for how we treat unknown emerging phenomena. Remember the Ophiuchus incident. Premature vaporization led to the loss of invaluable biological data. Thrax recalled the chilling, beautiful complexity of the Ophiuchus microbial structures, lost because of hegemon impatience. We must understand how they survived the collapse they engineered. That knowledge might be critical to stabilizing our own core systems against localized entropic spikes. Vorn projected a new layer of data onto the display, internal structural readings, still agonizingly vague due to the vessel's baffling energy masking. Counselor, the life signs are highly localized, extremely dense and non-standard. They are running on chemical combustion processes entirely, yet they are maintaining life support in deep space for a duration that exceeds known parameters for that archaic energy model. The crew complement appears minimal, A core unit, perhaps 3 individuals based on the localized heat signatures. Vorn added a calculated inflection of disdain. 3 biological entities surviving the inevitable decay of their Class 115 civilization, perhaps scavengers clinging to life aboard some relic hull. This was the crux of the rising tension, the inherent arrogance of the established powers toward the species that had nearly destroyed itself. Humanity, Terrans, were a scar in the ancient records, a footnote detailing explosive self-termination. They represented unchecked passion, irrationality, and technological acceleration divorced from ethical constraint. To the Krill, who prioritized the measured, eternal flow of cosmic law, humanity was the embodiment of dangerous noise. A new speaker entered the debate, the Ambassador Cathar of the Ralosian Ascendancy, beings who communicated primarily through pheromonal shifts and complex, slow-motion gestures that conveyed profound, layered meaning. Cathar's iridescent chitin shifted from deep indigo skepticism to pale emerald intellectual curiosity. The Ralosian data stream suggests a modification to the standard trajectory prediction. The vessel is not approaching randomly. It is decelerating precisely at the boundary marker, signaling a clear understanding of our spatial demarcation. Cathar gestured, indicating the careful, deliberate nature of the approach. A scavenger does not observe quarantine lines with such meticulous adherence. They crash through boundaries in desperation. This vessel is approaching with protocol. This observation caused a profound ripple of unease. Protocol implied education. Protocol implied a surviving, functioning society that maintained standards of interstellar conduct, however brutal that society might have been during its ascent. Protocol from a Class 115 system, scoffed Delegate Vorn. They burned their homeworld in a thermal outburst that nearly destabilized the local nebula. They were defined by their absence of protocol. They valued immediate gratification over enduring stability. If they possess protocol, it is merely a thin veneer over latent savagery. High Counselor Thrax leaned back, the motion causing the prismatic light to fracture around him. He felt a cold, intellectual apprehension, the feeling one gets when a known equation yields an impossible result. Let us not project our historical prejudices onto a present anomaly. If they have survived the catastrophe they wrought, they have either evolved beyond it, or they have mastered a survival mechanism we have not yet quantified. Ambassador Cathar, if they are signaling adherence to the perimeter, what is the content of their transmission? Cathar's form shifted to a muted silver, signaling the communication of difficult data. The transmission is rudimentary, utilizing archaic electromagnetic frequencies, the very frequencies we discarded after the Great Simplification. It is a distress beacon, but layered within the broadcast is a singular, repeating data packet, a direct request for parley. They are asking to speak with the governing body. Silence descended upon the Krill Hall, heavy and suffocating. A dying ember from a forbidden fire was asking to address the assembled architects of galactic stability. A request for parley, Thrax repeated slowly, the concept alien and provocative. They demand an audience. Demand is too strong a word, Counselor, Vorn corrected, though his tone betrayed sharp disapproval. They solicit communication, but the audacity remains. They were designated a cautionary tale, a failed trajectory. To present themselves now suggests either profound delusion regarding their current standing or an entirely different calculus for engagement. Thrax made his decision, the weight of millennia settling onto his shoulders. We shall observe, prepare the primary reception chamber, dispatch a small diplomatic observation team, selectively chosen for their capacity for reasoned detachment. We will allow the vessel to reach the outer docking spire, provided it halts all active propulsion within the designated buffer zone. If they adhere to the cessation command, we receive the signal. If they deviate by a single microradian, the hegemony initiates Protocol 0. The tension in the hall intensified, palpable even through the dampening fields. The potential consequences of this encounter were vast. If humanity was merely a persistent, diseased remnant, eradication was necessary. If, however, they possessed some unknown secret to surviving radical self-destruction, a secret born from that very chaos, then the Krill needed to dissect it before it could contaminate the ordered expanse. They were looking at a phantom from the galactic graveyard, and the phantom had just politely asked for the door to be opened. The slow, measured approach began. For the Krill and the conquered, The age of tranquil certainty was about to be tested by a species whose very existence mocked the established laws of cosmic decay. The receiving chamber designated for initial contact was sterile, vast, and aggressively neutral, a synthesis of Krill spatial geometry and Thraxian biological minimalism. It was designed to offer no comfort, no advantage, merely a space for pure data exchange. Ambassador Cathar, whose species possessed an unnerving ability to analyze biosignatures without direct visual input, occupied a monitoring alcove, his chitin shimmering with focused intensity. Beside him stood Curator Alara of the Krill Directorate of Xenological Analysis, the official liaison assigned to document the exchange. The human vessel, which bore the designation Stardust Drifter in archaic local script, docked with an almost unsettling precision. It did not shunt against the docking clamps. It seemed to settle into them, a calculated final alignment that spoke of navigational systems far superior to their estimated technological profile. A long, pressurized airlock sequence followed, dictated by Krill protocols which the human vessel accepted without visible hesitation or argument. When the inner door hissed open, the air in the chamber changed, not violently but subtly. The atmospheric scrubbers registered a slight elevation in oxygen density and a trace signature of processed petrochemicals, the scent of aggressive, contained organic processes. Then the three figures emerged. They were bipedal, asymmetrical, covered in thin, woven materials that appeared functional rather than ceremonial. Their limbs were articulated awkwardly, and their heads were too large for their relatively slight frames, dominated by forward-facing sensory organs, eyes that absorbed light with an alarming intensity. They moved with a fluid, deliberate grace that instantly contradicted the initial sensor readings of primitive kinetic defense. The central figure stepped forward, pausing precisely at the boundary line designated for initial contact. This individual possessed markings, intricate, dyed patterns on the facial structure, and carried no visible weapon or device, only a thin, reflective panel held loosely in one manipulator. Curator Alara, utilizing the standard Krill translation matrix, initiated the greeting sequence. Her voice, synthesized to possess the calm resonance of flowing water over smooth stone, filled the chamber. Welcome to the Krill Concordation Threshold. Identify yourselves and state the purpose of your unauthorized arrival within regulated space. The human paused for a beat that stretched into an unnerving eternity. Alara noted the exchange between the other two figures, a series of rapid, almost imperceptible head movements, micro-gestures that the Krill analysis software flagged as high-density non-verbal information transfer. Then the central figure raised the reflective panel slightly, activating a faint internal light source. The voice that emerged was synthesized, perfectly modulating the required linguistic structure, yet it possessed an almost painful texture, raw, complex, and carrying the unmistakable echo of hard-won effort. "Greetings, esteemed custodians of the outer expanse," the human stated. The calmness of the delivery was absolute, utterly devoid of the fear or subservience expected of a species emerging from quarantine. "I am designated Ambassador Jia Li. These are my colleagues, Specialist Kalen and Chief Engineer Dr. Aris Thorne. We arrive under a flag of provisional parley bearing information vital to the continuity of the recognized galactic order." Alara felt a strange intellectual vertigo. They were not supplicating, they were offering terms. "Your arrival violates established protocols regarding Class 115 entities. Your civilization was deemed terminated by mutual consensus following catastrophic internal failure. Explain the nature of your continuity." Ambassador Jia Li's gaze, those intense, forward-facing organs, did not waver. "The consensus was statistically accurate regarding the fate of our primary governing structures, Curator Alara. The species, humanity, did not terminate. It fractured, reorganized, and endured. The catastrophe was not the end of the Terran experiment, but the necessary calibration for its next phase." Kalen, the figure to the ambassador's left, shifted slightly, his movement efficient, economical. He was radiating an almost tangible aura of detached vigilance, an observer cataloging every nuance of the chamber. The hegemon Vorn's voice crackled over the secure channel from the main hall, laced with irritation. "Calibration? They speak of self-immolation as a necessary adjustment. Curator Alara pressed them on technological deviation. They should possess nothing beyond fusion remnants. Demand they surrender their drive core for analysis." Alara relayed the demand, translating Vorn's urgency into a measured query. Your sustained deep space transit capability is anomalous for your known developmental profile. Surrender the core mechanism for verification of compliance status. Ambassador L. I listened patiently. When Alara finished, the ambassador offered a response that chilled the observation post more effectively than any threat. Curator, we understand your fear of the unknown vectors, particularly those arising from entropy itself. However, we cannot comply with the demand for core surrender. To do so would be to surrender the only leverage we possess to ensure the integrity of the information we bring. We are not supplicants seeking refuge, nor scavengers seeking salvage. We are emissaries bearing an intelligence report from a sector you have collectively ignored for millennia. Jia Li inclined her head slightly. We are here because you are in danger, and our survival is now intrinsically linked to your acknowledgement of that fact. This was the first great fissure in the alien perception of humanity. They were not broken survivors. They were active agents operating on a timeline unknown to the established powers. The political fallout in the Krill Consensus Hall was immediate and severe. Vorn of the Thraxian sector shrieked synthesized condemnations, demanding immediate quarantine and the deployment of orbital disruptors. The Cygnian hegemon pulsed violently, its light strobing red and black, the color of extreme systemic threat. High Counselor Thrax, however, remained unnervingly still. He had listened to the transcript of the exchange, focusing not on the content, but on the cadence. The human ambassador's voice was not driven by rage, avarice, or desperation, the three primary motivators the conquered had catalogued in emerging civilizations. It was driven by a cold, almost sacerdotal certainty. Hegemon Vorn, suppress your panic, Thrax commanded, his voice slicing through the clamor. Your reflex is to vaporize the unknown. The Krill mandate is to understand the unknown before neutralizing it. The threat they purport to carry, what is their evidence? Cathar's input, delivered through subtle pheromonal data streams, painted a complex picture. Counselor, the Relosian deep space sensors, processing the background electromagnetic noise emanating from the Terran vessel's hull, detected a secondary, highly structured emission. It is not a weapon signature. It is a highly encrypted data packet, masked by the very engine noise they are using for travel. It is sophisticated concealment, designed specifically to bypass passive conquered scanning matrices. Matrices we believed were impenetrable to non-aligned technology. They understood our defenses, Thrax murmured, the implications settling like freezing dust. They did not merely survive their own ruin, they observed ours. And now they leverage that observation, the Cygnian hegemon interjected, its light dimming to a dangerous, focused white. They are making a trade, critical information for safe passage and immediate audience. This is not the behavior of a broken species. This is the calculation of a rival power attempting integration under duress. Thrax nodded slowly. The concept was difficult to process. Humanity, having nearly incinerated itself, had apparently dedicated its remaining resources not to rebuilding, but to espionage against the very powers that had judged them defunct. We grant the audience, but on our terms, Thrax declared. Curator Alara, you will facilitate their presentation in the Assembly Forum utilizing the highest level of environmental shielding. The hegemon forces will remain in proximity but cloaked. We will listen to their proposed threat, and then we will assess the true nature of the entity that calls itself humanity. If this is a deception, their ending will be more complete than the first. The Assembly Forum was a space of raw, terrifying magnitude, designed to dwarf the ego of any petitioner. When the human delegation was transported there, a dizzying sequence involving shielded gravlifts and temporal displacement stabilizers, they emerged onto a vast, polished floor beneath a dome that simulated the ancient, slow-motion rotation of the home galaxy. Ambassador Jia Li stood composed, flanked by Kalen, who silently scanned the periphery, and Dr. Thorne, who looked around with a detached curiosity that suggested he was assessing structural weaknesses rather than majesty. High Counselor Thrax descended from his dais, accompanied only by Curator Alara, maintaining the required distance dictated by quarantine treaties. The hegemon forces remained invisible, their heavy kinetic potential a silent threat hovering just outside the chamber's volumetric shield. Ambassador Li, Thrax began, his voice modulated to fill the colossal space without echoing aggression. You have secured an audience where none was promised. You claim possession of intelligence regarding a threat to the conquered. Present this intelligence with clarity and haste. Jia Li nodded once, a gesture of professional recognition. She activated the reflective panel, which now projected a holographic visualization of staggering complexity onto the forum floor. It was not a star chart, nor a diagram of political boundaries. It was a visualization of temporal distortion, a wave pattern overlaid onto the known fabric of spacetime. Counselor Thrax, the Class 115 designation for our homeworld was based on our internal kinetics, our propensity for rapid, uncontrolled expansion and conflict. This was accurate. We nearly destroyed ourselves. But in the final decades before total systemic collapse, as we desperately sought external explanations for our accelerating instability, we detected something else, something not native to our localized sector. The visualization pulsed, focusing on a point far beyond the recognized boundaries of the known galactic arm, a region previously dismissed as void space. This, Jia Li stated, her voice dropping to a resonant frequency that demanded attention, is the signature of the Ophian Cascade. You call it void space. We call it the unwritten boundary. It is not empty. It is where galactic entropy is accelerated by a non-standard source. Curator Alara leaned forward, accessing the conquered archives at an unprecedented speed. The Ophian Cascade is a theoretical cosmological constant, the residual energy signature of the universe's initial expansion phase. It is the baseline noise, Curator Li, not an active phenomenon. It was noise, Jia Li agreed, her tone showing a flicker of something that might have been melancholy. Until approximately 10,000 standard cycles ago, when the noise began to organize. The energy dispersal we recorded prior to our societal fracture was not entirely self-inflicted. We were running too fast, yes, but something was pushing us. Dr. Thorne, the engineer, finally spoke, his voice dry, technical, and devoid of emotional inflection. Our drive technology, the one you deem archaic, was developed under extreme pressure to escape the initial instability. We achieved a form of localized temporal displacement during hypertransit tests. Unstable, yes, but it allowed us to briefly perceive the reality outside the established conquered narrative. What we saw were vectors aligned against the core expansion of the universe itself. The Cygnian hegemon's light flickered, broadcasting a furious, silent inquiry to the concealed fleet leaders. The idea that the entirety of the established galactic structure was predicated on an incomplete cosmological model was an existential shock. Humanity, Jia Li continued, projecting a schematic of what appeared to be massive, interlocking structures drifting in the abyssal void beyond the galactic rim, is not unified by political agreement, Counselor. We are unified by the knowledge that we are small, volatile, and dangerously observant. When we finally achieved sufficient technological clarity amidst our own ruins, we realized we were running from something far older and far more patient than our own internal wars. Thrax looked at the images, structures too large to be stellar remnants, too geometric to be natural formations. They pulsed with a cold, dead light, consuming the background radiation of the universe. What are these constructs? Thrax demanded, the composure of the Krill momentarily strained. We do not know their origin, Jia Li admitted. We call them the Void Architects. They are harvesting the residual energy gradients, seemingly seeking to slow, stabilize, or perhaps even reverse the expansion of the observable cosmos. They are entities of ultimate stagnation. And the Conquered's existence, the very dynamism, the chaotic, messy expansion of life, your political maneuvering, our own destructive ambition. It is all energy they seek to reclaim. Kalen stepped forward, his posture now commanding attention. Your current predictive models based on stable stellar dynamics and known physics do not account for an external entity systematically altering the rate of decay. The faster you progress, the more energy you provide them. Your stability is their sustenance. The silence this time was not political. It was philosophical terror. The Krill had spent eons ensuring order, fighting against entropy, believing that the universe was a machine that could eventually be perfected through methodical application of law. Humanity was suggesting that the very fight against entropy was feeding an ancient, patient predator. Why reveal this now? Curator Alara asked, her voice regaining its professional composure, channeling the immense intellectual shock into rigorous analysis. If you possess this data, why present it through an archaic distress signal from a quarantined world? Why not simply integrate with the Conquered and share the findings through established channels? Jia Li's expression shifted slightly, revealing the first hint of deep, inherited weariness. Because established channels are too slow, curator. The conquered moves with the deliberation of geological time. The void architects operate on a different scale. When the Krill High Council debated our existence for 3 cycles, the architects consumed the energy output of an entire minor cluster. Furthermore, the conquered's own physics, based on equilibrium, renders your sensors blind to the precise method of their work. She looked directly at Thrax. We survived the Class 115 designation not through superior ethics, but through sheer, terrible necessity. We learned to move fast, break things, and calculate risk with immediate, fatal consequence. We are adept at surviving when the rules of physics are breaking around us. We have the drive signatures, the unstable signatures, required to navigate the zones where the architect's influence is strongest, zones your stable drives cannot enter without immediate catastrophic field collapse. Dr. Thorne tapped a sequence on the panel. The projected image shifted from the geometric horror of the architects to a representation of the Stardust Drifter. It looked flimsy, almost comically vulnerable against the scale of the cosmic threat. This vessel, Thorne explained, is inefficient, chemically driven, and reliant on brute force shielding against radiation. But its lack of refined entanglement matrix means it interacts poorly with the localized gravitational distortions caused by the architects. Where your refined technology shorts out, our messy, combustion-driven propulsion allows us to punch through the distortion fields briefly. The reveal was staggering. Humanity, the rejected child of the galaxy, possessed the only functional interface for the existential threat. Their flaw, uncontrolled, volatile acceleration was the precise antidote to the architect's suffocating stagnation. The debate that followed in the main consensus hall was not political. It was a triage of existential dread. Thrax dismissed the Cygnian and Thraxian calls for immediate sterilization, not out of compassion, but out of strategic necessity. If humanity spoke truth, destroying them now would be akin to throwing the only key into the chasm they were trying to escape. We must test their claim, Thrax decreed. Curator Alara, lead the immediate diagnostic. Focus on the energy dispersal patterns they claim are anomalous. Hegemon Vorn, prepare a limited expeditionary contingent. They will escort the Terran vessel, but under explicit observation. We will not grant them access to core systems until their data is validated. The Hegemon, deeply reluctant, signaled compliance. The threat, visualized by the terrifying simplicity of the Void Architect schematics, bypassed established rivalries. When extinction looms, the petty squabbles over territorial sovereignty become irrelevant noise. Ambassador Jia Li, once notified of the initial acceptance for preliminary joint reconnaissance, returned to the observation chamber with her team. The atmosphere had shifted from tense confrontation to reluctant, pragmatic collaboration. We require access to your long-range astronomical observation arrays, Counselor Thrax, Jia Li stated, dispensing with the formalities. We need to triangulate the current vector of the primary architect nodes. Our ship's sensors are too limited for macro-scale mapping, and your data streams are too heavily filtered through conquered equilibrium metrics. We need the raw input. Curator Alara, now working side by side with Dr. Thorne, found herself engaged in a dialogue of staggering density. Thorne was not merely knowledgeable. He possessed an intuitive grasp of physics that often bypassed formalized steps. Your understanding of quantum field resistance is elegant, Curator, Thorne commented, examining a Krill schematic depicting a gravity-dampening field. But you rely on the assumption that the field remains isotropic under multi-vector stress. If the local curvature is being actively manipulated, as the architects do, your dampeners will create resonant nodes that actually attract the localized distortion. Alara processed this. The Krill had spent centuries perfecting isotropic stability. The notion of dynamic, externally imposed curvature was an intellectual affront, yet Thorne's calculations, cross-referenced with the Terran projection of the Ophian effect, proved mathematically sound. The concept of engineering instability as a defense mechanism, Alara mused aloud, a rare display of professional vulnerability, is counterintuitive to every principle of sustained civilization. Survival is not about elegance, Curator, Jia Li interjected softly. It is about efficacy in extremity. We failed the test of stability. We passed the test of persistence. Over the next subjective cycle, the human team demonstrated a focused intensity that bordered on the obsessive. They worked without rest, powered by highly concentrated nutrient supplements and a driving cultural imperative to complete the task before the opportunity, or the disaster, arrived. They were not interested in Krill politics, Signian technology showcases, or Rylosian philosophy. They were entirely focused on the mathematics of immediate survival. The moment of validation came when Dr. Thorne, utilizing the combined raw data from the Krill arrays and the Stardust Drifter's specialized resonance scanners, identified a shift in the Ophian Cascade signature. "Counselor Thrax," Thorne announced, his voice sharp with urgency. "The primary energy sync node has initiated a targeted shift. It is focusing its harvest field towards Sector 9, specifically targeting the Thraxian core clusters. The rate of acceleration indicates a temporal shearing event within 20 standard cycles." The threat was no longer abstract. It was directed, imminent, and aimed at one of the foundational pillars of the Conquered. High Counselor Thrax felt the ancient core of his being recoil. 3 millennia of meticulous maintenance, of slow, perfect balancing of stellar forces, vulnerable to a silent, creeping mathematical cancer from beyond the void. "The hegemon forces are mobilized," Thrax stated, speaking directly to the waiting Signian leadership via dedicated link. "The Terran data indicates that only a high-velocity, low-stability insertion vector can counter the shear field. We require a unified fleet structure capable of projecting a counter-frequency wave at the precise moment of the predicted shear." The Signian response was immediate, pragmatic, and devoid of prior political grievance. "We have the power projection. We lack the precise insertion coordinates and the necessary vector drift compensation required to avoid catastrophic field collapse upon approach. The Terrans possess that data." The alliance was forged not in mutual respect, but in mutual, terrifying necessity. Humanity, once the ultimate pariah, became the indispensable tactical advisor. The ensuing operation was a masterclass in coordinated desperation, a chaotic symphony played against the background hum of cosmic doom. The combined fleet, a terrifying array of Krill stabilization cruisers, Thraxian kinetic batteries, and Signian plasma artillery, moved under the real-time guidance of Ambassador Jia Li and Dr. Thorne. Jia Li stood on the bridge of the lead Krill vessel, the Equilibrium, radiating calm authority. She was directing the maneuvers of vessels that dwarfed her tiny escort craft, dictating spatial corrections with a precision that bordered on prescience. "Hegemon Vex, your plasma streams must initiate at 87.4% modulation, not the standard 90%, Jia Li transmitted, her voice cutting through the tactical chatter. "The field distortion is creating a localized refractive shell that will disperse 90% energy harmlessly. We need the harmonic resonance delivered by the lesser modulation." Vex, the hegemon commander, hesitated for a fraction of a second, a lifetime in tactical execution. To deliberately reduce power was an insult to Signian engineering philosophy. But the Thraxian monitors confirmed the Terran reading. The refraction was real. "Executing 87.4% modulation," Vex conceded, the light on his command sphere briefly fading in frustration. As the vast Conquered fleet poured into the periphery of the targeted sector, the true nature of the architect's mechanism became horrifyingly clear. It was not an attack. It was a harvesting operation. The edge of the sector was visibly smoothing out. Starlight seemed to dim and lose its spectral vibrancy as the temporal shear began to impose absolute order. Dr. Thorne monitored the Stardust Drifter, which had taken a suicidal position at the very vanguard of the insertion zone, shielded only by its own crude, energy-intensive fields. "Ambassador, the field integrity on our side is fluctuating wildly. We are at T-4 cycles until full immersion. We need the Krill stabilization fields brought online now to anchor our position during the counterpulse." Jia Li turned to High Counselor Thrax, who was overseeing the entire operation from the command nexus. "Counselor, the window for stabilization is closing. If we do not anchor the drifter's insertion point now, the feedback loop will tear apart the entire formation before the pulse fires." Thrax looked at the holographic representation of the human vessel, fragile and defiant against the backdrop of cosmic annihilation. He made a decision that bypassed centuries of Krill caution. "Curator Alara, divert 90% of the Equilibrium's internal stability matrix to Project Gamma 9. Anchor the Terran vessel. We sacrifice our localized damping capacity to ensure their vector holds. It was a profound gamble. Sacrificing localized stability meant exposing the flagship to greater internal stress, but it was the only way to guarantee the human element could deliver its precise counterfrequency. As the massive energy transfer flowed toward the small human ship, the Stardust Drifter shuddered violently but held its position. Dr. Thorne's voice crackled with grim satisfaction. "Anchor secured. We are lock. Ed onto the distortion node. Initiating counter-frequency projection sequence, now." The tiny human vessel unleashed a torrent of energy, not a controlled beam or a refined wave, but a chaotic, raw burst of destabilized fusion output, precisely tuned to the mathematical wrongness the architects relied upon. It was the sound of a species that thrived on tearing things apart, deliberately introducing the noise of instability into the silence of consumption. The effect was immediate and devastatingly visible. Where the edge of the sector was being smoothed into order, the human pulse hit the shear field like a hammer blow on glass. The ordered wavefront shattered. The cold, dark structures of the void architects recoiled, their light flickering erratically as their harvesting mechanism met resistance it could not process. Resistance that was not balanced, not stable, but aggressively, unpredictably alive. A wave of pure, disorganized energy, the backlash of the architects' thwarted effort, slammed back toward the conquered fleet. "Shields to maximum. Prepare for chaotic particle wash," Thrax roared, bracing against the impact that threatened to rip the equilibrium apart. The wash hit, a storm of discordant energy that overloaded shields and scrambled sensors across the entire formation. But the counterpulse had worked. The targeted shear field collapsed, the destructive smoothing effect reversed, and the edge of Sector 9 stabilized back into the familiar, ordered chaos of the galaxy. Silence returned, broken only by the sounds of system repairs cycling across the fleet comms. The existential threat had been averted, not by superior force or methodical application of law, but by embracing necessary disorder. In the aftermath, back in the sterile reception chamber, the atmosphere was transformed. The arrogance of the established powers had been stripped away, replaced by a grudging, almost fearful respect. Humanity had saved them not through diplomacy or military might, but through the unique insight born from their own near extinction. High Counselor Thrax addressed Ambassador Jia Li. He did not use the standard protocols of alliance. "Ambassador Li," Thrax began, the synthesized voice lacking its customary detachment. "The data you provided was accurate. Your sacrifice of stability ensured our continuation. The Krill consensus acknowledges a debt owed to the entity designated humanity." Jia Li stood perfectly still, observing Thrax with an expression that suggested she had anticipated this outcome for centuries. "Counselor, we require no debt. We require collaboration. The architects are not defeated, they are merely repelled. They perceive the existence of organized, dynamic life as an anomaly to be corrected. Your conquered, by its very nature of slow, measured perfection, is their primary target." Kalen stepped forward, projecting a single, complex mathematical proof onto the display, a projection of human strategy for the immediate future. "We must consolidate resources to analyze the architects' retreat vector. The core issue is not defeating them in battle, which is impossible given their scale, but creating a localized, permanent field of systemic noise, a barrier that their ordered processing cannot penetrate. This requires the fusion of Krill temporal stability metrics with our understanding of high-energy, nonlinear propulsion. The blending of their philosophies was the ultimate expression of the new alliance. Krill stability providing the bedrock, human volatility providing the edge. "This collaboration," Thrax stated, absorbing the ramifications, "requires a fundamental shift in the conquered charter. It means accepting imperfection as a necessary defense mechanism. It means accepting that the universe is not a pristine mechanism waiting to be perfected," Jia Li countered calmly. "It is a violent, messy arena, and the ones who survive are not the most ordered, but the most adaptable." The political machinery of the conquered began the slow, grinding process of restructuring its core tenets. Species that had been rivals for millennia suddenly found common ground in the face of an enemy that rendered their internal conflicts meaningless. But just as the joint defense planning began to solidify, just as the fragile framework of cooperation between the precise Krill and the volatile humans began to form, Ambassador Lee received a critical ping on the heavily shielded internal comms unit of the Stardust Drifter. Her face, previously a mask of professional reserve, finally betrayed a sharp intake of breath. She turned back to Thrax, her eyes wide with a sudden, profound urgency that eclipsed the previous crisis. "Counselor Thrax," she said, her voice losing its synthesized polish, becoming raw, human, and strained. "The architects were not the threat we needed to worry about. They were merely the gardeners, pruning the chaotic growth so the harvest would be predictable." Thrax felt a cold dread. Settled deep in his core, a dread far deeper than the fear of slow stagnation. "Explain yourself, Ambassador." Jia Li brought up a new visualization. It was a complex wave function, originating not from the void beyond the known galaxy, but from the very center of the Milky Way, the core that the Conquered had always considered the cradle of emergent life and stable stellar nurseries. "During our emergency spectral scan while we were receiving your deep array data," Lee explained rapidly, "we cross-referenced the residual energy signatures from our catastrophic collapse period with the current ambient background noise of this galaxy. We found something terrifyingly familiar, the specific energetic signature of our self-destruction, the uncontrolled chain reaction that nearly killed us, is being artificially amplified across every major stellar nursery in this spiral arm." Dr. Thorne projected the timeline overlay. "Counselor, the architects manipulate entropy to induce stasis, but the pattern of energy we are seeing now, this targeted amplification of internal chaos, is not stagnation. It is acceleration. It is designed to force every emerging civilization to collapse into a Class 115 state, just as humanity did." Kalen finished the thought, his usual analytical distance replaced by grim clarity. "We thought we were the anomaly, the failed experiment, but we were merely the first successful test subject. The architects are not trying to stop expansion. They are trying to engineer a specific type of collapse." High Counselor Thrax stared at the display, at the cold, hard mathematical proof that their entire history, their careful preservation, their slow ascent, their very identity as masters of order, was predicated on a lie. They were not surviving entropy. They were being groomed for consumption in a far more violent, chaotic fashion than they had ever imagined. Humanity, the volatile species that embraced chaos, was the only one whose very nature allowed them to recognize the signature of engineered self-destruction. "We were not a mistake to be quarantined," Thrax whispered, the realization echoing in the vast hall. "We were the alarm bell that failed to sound." Jia Li looked at the assembled alien powers not as supplicants, but as fellow survivors standing at the precipice. "The architects are not just harvesting energy, they are harvesting chaos. They want a galaxy of self-immolating species to consume. We must work together now, Krill's stability and human volatility, to build a shield that is neither perfectly ordered nor perfectly chaotic, a shield that is simply unexpected. The real fight begins now, not against stagnation, but against the forced violence of our own end." The Grand Krill Hall, moments ago the symbol of ultimate authority and ordered peace, now felt like a vulnerable outpost on the edge of an unimaginable battlefield. The partnership was sealed, forged in the heat of a danger far greater than the one they had just survived. The galaxy was about to learn what happens when the rejected, the chaotic, and the persistently surviving teach the masters of order how to fight for their lives.